All right, we are live. Happy Sunday, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are starting right at 2 o'clock today. Jumping things off, getting things going. We'll give it 1 minute just to allow everybody to get caught up for the stream, to catch up, for everybody to log in and sign in and be here and join us on this overcast, almost autumn. I guess it's autumn. Technically, it's autumn, right, Bella? It's actually autumn.
It is autumn.
Day here in San Francisco. How's everybody doing out there? Where is everyone from? I like to start this every week by everyone dropping into the chat room. You see it right there. It's off to the side of the screen. Where's everyone joining us from today? Generally, we have people from all over the world. It always gets me very fired up and excited to see everyone popping in. Whether you're here live or you're watching this at a future date, maybe you're watching the recording, that's okay. I know not everybody can join us on Sunday, and that's the whole point of this. This link will turn into a recording after the class. So you'll be able to revert back to this. You can watch this at any time. If things start getting too fast for you, or going at too quickly of a pace, or maybe you need to take a break, maybe you need to step outside or take a phone call, do something with the kids, that's all okay. All you have to do is hit that pause button. You can come back to the video. You can start watching this at any time. So that's the beauty of a live stream like this. It is live. It's interactive. I can't see you, but of course you can see me. But that's what the chat room is there for. It's so I get to enjoy and talk to all of you, almost as if we're actually there with each other, and I'm there in every single one of your kitchens, helping you through this entire recipe.
Great, we got Judith from Austin, Texas. We have Elena from Croatia. Welcome.
Croatia, wow.
San Francisco, DC. John's here. Hey, John. Shout out to John.
Shout out to John. John is a regular here.
Keith and Rachel in Piedmont. Yes.
Awesome.
Hi.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome
Mike.
all the newcomers, the new pasta people.
Mike and Colleen from Chi-Town.
Chi-Town, shout out.
Yeah.
One of our favorite cities to visit. As always, Bella is in the chat room helping organize all of the tech behind the scenes here. So because that chat room is there, it is designed for you to be able to ask questions throughout this entire journey today. Whether it be about the recipe that we're making, something you've always wondered about cooking, maybe something about my culinary journey, or just time and experience being a chef. It's all on the table. I'm here for all of you. I love talking and I love sharing stories and food. So chat room is there. Feel free to use it as needed. If you ask a question and we're not really at that part of the recipe, like maybe you're asking about something way at the end, we're going to hold off on answering that. Simply because we want to stay on track and we don't want to get too far off course. So just trying to keep questions about the recipe at that part of the recipe when we're actually working at it, so things don't get out of hand. Now, as I said, we're going to be cooking through everything start to finish today. Nothing needed to be done ahead of time aside from maybe the whipped ricotta if you wanted to garnish your pasta, the basil oil or herb oil if you wanted to garnish your pasta with that. The links for both of those, how to make the videos, if you missed it, is at the bottom of the recipe page. You can use any oil. You don't need the ricotta. This pasta is going to be absolutely delicious as it is. We're going to be making the gluten-free dough today. We're going to be making that fresh tomato spaghetto. And I also included my cashew e pepe. That's like a nut instead of cheese. Cashew e pepe recipe on the recipe page as well. We're not going to be making that recipe. It's simple enough. It's blended cashews with the hot pasta water, some seasoning and aromatics in there. It gets super creamy. You won't even notice that you're missing the cheese, or at least I don't notice that I'm missing the cheese when I eat that dish. It's absolutely fire, and I love it, but we're not going to make it today. It's just there for everyone to have, just as another option, because, you know, more is usually better.
All right, we got Adam from Vancouver. We have Daniel from LA. Hey, Daniel. Caitlin is not feeling well. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry to hear that, Caitlin.
Tell her we say hi.
Yeah, we say hi, Caitlin.
All right, let's get started.
Let's get started. Okay, so I think that covers all of the basics of the day, how the day is going to work and operate. Let's jump right into it. We're going to start with our gluten-free dough. I have all of my stuff here down on a tray. Now, when we're talking about a gluten-free dough, this is not a sponsored series or post or anything, class, by that means. But I did have the opportunity to try out a variety of different gluten-free flours in preparation for this. I found a few that worked really well. I found some that didn't work so well. And I put the links down below and in all of the emails and recipe pages for the ones that I found best. My favorite being this Caputo brand. Caputo is like a well-known bread, pizza, pasta flour company. So it only makes sense that since we are making pasta today, their gluten-free version of flour actually did work the best. So surprise, surprise, they know what they're doing. The Bob's 1-for-1 baking flour also worked. It had a little bit of a stronger flavor that may have been from like the chickpea or some of those alternative starches that they have in there. This one here is interesting. What it's made up of is a combination of rice flour, potato starches, vegetable fibers. It's using guar gum as the emulsifier versus xanthan gum that a lot of the other gluten-free flours will use. So I don't know if that makes too much of a difference. But it's entirely gluten-free. It has the mix all done. I've tried on other occasions going as far to make my own gluten-free flour blend. And it's a lot of work. You got to grind either the rice, you got to grind quinoa, you got to grind the starches, you got to get a whole bunch of different ingredients, and then figure out the ratio of those ingredients to get it into a set mix. So bypassing all of that, someone does something well, they put all of these research dollars, time, and energy into creating this product. That's what I go ahead and have here. So I'm going to go ahead and just get this started. I already have it weighed out in my bowl. And then to that, I like to start doing this in a bowl. Yes, question before we get going.
Yes, Elena wants to know, is there a vegan gluten-free pasta option with chia egg substitute?
Yes, so good point. We were about to get to that as we got to the egg. So this dough recipe is not technically vegan because there is an egg in here. What the egg does is it helps act and bind everything together. So alternatively, if you're not going to use egg and you want this to be vegan, what I recommend is using like the egg substitute, the liquid egg substitute. I see it at Whole Foods. I think it's like called Just Egg or something like that, but there's actually no egg in it. What it actually is modified vegetable protein. It's made from mung bean isolates that they grow. They take that protein, they blend it with canola oil, a series of stabilizing gums, and you have like something that's similar to egg without, it has the properties and qualities of egg without any of the salt that vegans don't eat. So we have the egg here, we have our olive oil, and we have our water. We have our flour blend. So if you're not using egg, an egg substitute would work well here in this case. I haven't tested it out just leaving egg out entirely. I think you need the egg, just going off of intuition, to get something to hold this together. You need some sort of binder.
You can also use just egg, Kimberly says.
That's what I said.
Yes.
Oh,
perfect.
great. Yeah, I'm glad Kimberly agrees with me.
Great.
And then so what we're going to do, you could do this in a stand mixer. I'm going to go ahead and put it here into a bowl just so you can see it coming together as we do this by hand. But during my trials and my testing, I did it in the stand mixer with the dough hook, just so I didn't have to get my hands all sticky. But I wanted to do it in a glass bowl so everyone could watch and see this come together. And it's as simple as getting all of your ingredients together here into the mix, starting with our egg. I like to have everything room temperature whenever I'm making any sort of dough, whether it be gluten-free or it be a regular style dough. I just found room temperature things are easier to mix, are easier to hydrate, and easier to come together rather than working with an ice cold egg right out of the fridge or ice cold water out of the tap. So we're using room temperature water, we're using a room temperature egg. If perchance your egg is ice cold right out of the fridge, a good little kitchen hack to get yourself around that situation, whether you're baking or working on this today, is to take your egg and put it into a bowl of warm water. That warm tap water, 2-3 minutes later, is going to bring your egg up to room temperature and you'll be good to go. I do that anytime I'm baking, quick and easy as I'm gathering the rest of my ingredients. So on top of this, we're going to add our olive oil and our water. The water is going to help hydrate, the egg's going to help bind, and the olive oil is going to help add some extra fat that's going to make the dough tender, more supple, and have a much better chew and mouthfeel. So that's where all of those different ingredients come into play to bring this together. So we're just going to start getting everybody together here in a bowl. And now I'm just going to use my hand, breaking up that egg yolk, getting that started here in the middle. And then I'm just going to slowly incorporate. I'm just using 2 fingers here as everything's still wet and shaggy.
Adam would like to know, can you use the food processor to mix the dough as well?
That's a good question, Adams. Adam's asking if I can use the food processor. So I have some friends of mine who are chefs that make all of their pasta doughs in the food processor. I personally have never gone that route. I feel like the blade and the mixing in a food processor is just a little too powerful and too intense and it really like agitates the dough. It rips and tears up and shreds the dough. Not to say you can't, as I know a lot of other people do it. It's just not a route that I usually go when I am mixing dough. So you could try it. It may work. It may not work for both those reasons that I was kind of talking about. And plus then you have like the food processor to clean up, get out of the cabinet or wherever you keep it. And so like this way you just have everything in a bowl and it kind of comes together rather nicely. So you can see now my stickiness has become less sticky. It's slowly, quickly turning into what looks like a dough. Now what's nice here about the world of gluten-free is that we don't really have to knead this. We don't have to worry about developing gluten. I'm just going to move this tray so it stops bouncing up and down on me. We don't have to worry about developing gluten. All we're really doing at this point is mixing in order to hydrate. We want to keep everything nice and homogeneous. We want to keep everything together. And we want all those starches, the vegetable fibers, the egg, the olive oil, everything in the dough to mix together evenly and distribute itself around, giving everybody a chance to really come together, to wake up, to come alive. You have all those stabilizers and gums in there, the guar gum, all those kind of like different vegetable isolates. And all of those have been dried out. Now that we've added liquid to this, both in the form of egg and in the form of water, we want to give those a chance to wake up, hydrate, come together. Think of it as like, whenever you hydrate anything, whether that be a packet of gelatin, lemonade, sugar, flour, bread, any sort of dough, you do want to give it a chance to hydrate. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes some time. So all we're doing here is evenly and easily mixing this all together in the dough, in the bowl. So taking a look, nice up and close, we have a smooth and supple dough. It's not too sticky. I just have a little bit of excess stickiness on my finger there, but this itself is not sticky. It's not sticking to my work surface. It's not sticking to the bowl. If you do find that for whatever reason, maybe you didn't weigh out your water or your oil and you're just going off like the cups or tablespoon measurements, you may find that maybe this is a tad on the sticky side. Don't be afraid to add a little more flour there to kind of adjust and account for that. But all in all, this dough should come together rather fast and quickly. Now normally, when we're talking pasta dough, if you were doing a gluten version of dough, what ends up happening is you want to create that gluten. What gluten is, it's a complex chain of protein that when it mixes with water, it forms that chain, that web that holds everything together. And through the kneading process, you're developing that chain, you're developing that gluten, and allowing that web to get longer and stronger. Now in this case, we have no gluten. There's no chain, there's no web, there's nothing that needs to be developed or worked longer and stronger. So once you feel that everything is homogeneous, everything is mixed together, everything is nice and smooth and not sticky, we're in a really good place to get our dough on the side to rest.
Greta's Life wants to know, add water if it's too dry.
Yes, so Greta's asking if it's too dry,
Greta's
same
Life.
thing, Greta's Life. Sorry, Greta's Life. Wanted to know, you add some water if it's too dry? Yes, same thing. I normally, whenever I'm adding water to any dough, my favorite way to do that is with a water mister. That way I'm able to just mist the dough very gently. You work a little bit of water in at a time, and you're not accidentally adding too much. Where I find sometimes if like you try to add like a tablespoon or a couple of drops, it comes in a little too fast or a little too quick, and you sometimes add a little too much water, and then you're playing that game where you're adding a little flour and a little water, and you're kind of going back and forth, which isn't necessarily the best thing. So just be mindful. A little bit of water can go a long way. Sometimes one little spritz is all you need to help that dough really come together and get to the point where you like it. So feel good about that. I'm going to get out a little container here because we're going to avoid the single-use plastics. We're going to set our dough into our container. We're going to throw a lid on that. And if you are using a zip top bag or something like that, you could just throw a cover onto this bowl. I just want to protect this from the air so that it doesn't dry out. And I want to be able to set it aside on the counter to let those starches and all those gums and things that we have going on, the different flours, mixing together in our dough to relax. So they're hydrating, they're coming to life, they're waking up, and then, so that way it is an even and equal mixture that we have to use. This isn't ready to use right away. That's okay. So this we're going to set on the side. We're done. Dough is resting. We're finished with our tray here. And now something real quick while that's resting. So we're talking about our spaghetti. We're going to get our ingredients together for that. As we do, let's get a pot of water on the stove. It doesn't need to be a super big pot, just something shallow with enough water to submerge the tomatoes in it. So I have maybe like 2 cups of water in here. We're going to throw this onto the high boil and then start prepping our tomatoes. Coming in here with a cutting board, we have our tomatoes. So it's the end of the summer, the late harvest, that end of the year when you're seeing lots and lots of tomatoes right at the end of the season at the farmer's market. And I thought it would be a great time to celebrate the tomato and share the opposite end of a canned tomato sauce is a fresh tomato sauce. Because often when I post or use canned tomatoes, people will message me or ask me and say, hey, can I use fresh tomatoes for this? And most of the time, you don't want to use fresh tomatoes. We're going to be using canned tomatoes or vice versa. Where this recipe and this sauce is really designed around the idea of using a fresh tomato. For a number of reasons. It celebrates the beauty of the tomato. You get that nice bright acidity and sweetness. And you'll see when we cook the pasta down in the tomato sauce, it's all part of that magic that happens. Question.
Avery would like to know, do you need to add xanthan gum if it's not already in the flour mix?
So if you're making your own flour mix,
or if it's not in the flour mix that they have?
If it's a gluten-free flour mix that you have, you shouldn't have to add anything to it. I'll say that. If it's a gluten-free flour mix that I tested, you definitely don't have to add anything to it. If it's a gluten-free flour mix that I did not test, one of the 2 that I recommended, then you might have to make adjustments to it, but I don't know. I haven't tried it. I don't know what's in it. I don't know which one you're referring to. Maybe if you drop it in the chat, I might know which one you're talking about, and I could maybe advise a little better. But if you're making your own flour mix, you definitely need some sort of guar gum or xanthan gum in there. If you're buying a flour mix that doesn't have it, like Caputo's doesn't have xanthan gum in it. That's okay. It has guar gum, so it's kind of doing the emulsification in a different way. The baking flour blends, like Bob's or Cup for Cup, is a baking flour blend. The xanthan gum helps as an emulsifier when you're using like a yeasted mixture or an egg mixture that you're going to bake in the oven. And since these are not really baked, we're doing pasta, it's a different gum that's needed, and so it's hard to say. I don't know what flour you're using. I hope that answers your question. Anything else?
Nope.
No. Okay, back to our tomatoes. So, fresh tomatoes at the summer, end of the summer. What you may be seeing now too at the market is what's called number 2 tomatoes. Maybe you don't have them on the table, but if you ask the farmer at the stand very nicely, say, hey, do you have any number 2 tomatoes? What that actually means, number 2, is like the second tier of tomatoes. So they have all those beautiful tomatoes that could go to the grocery store that they put out on the table that are great for slicing and eating and doing everything with. But number 2 tomatoes are maybe those tomatoes that got a little too ripe, maybe they got a little bruised, maybe they fell off the tree or smashed at the bottom of the crate. And so those number 2 tomatoes are great for things like this sauce. You usually get them at least half the price. They're just as delicious and sometimes even better because they're a little softer and sweeter. The same thing applies like if you're making jams or preserves. You ask for like the number 2 peaches because those are often a little more ripe, a little more bruised, but just as delicious and half the price for something you're going to be turning into a puree or a sauce. Did I see a question?
Yes, Avery just said I have Bob's Red Mill, but it's not the Cup for Cup version.
Bob's Red Mill, but it's a gluten-free flour, Bob's Red Mill. I would try it without the xanthan gum. Don't just start adding things to it because you don't know what you're adding or how much of it that you're adding. Trust the ingredient mix. Bob's Red Mill, gluten-free flour, give it a whirl, see what happens. If it's terrible, you could look at a different flour blend, but in theory it should work regardless because it's a gluten-free flour blend. So there's been some form of testing. I've only done with the Bob's, I've done Cup for Cup, I've done Bob's baking, and I've done Caputo gluten-free. So I've tested those 3, and the Caputo is the one that worked the best for me. The other ones worked, I just don't think they tasted as good. And I was going for flavor and texture, not just if it worked. Because at the end of the day, I wanted something that was actually like, hey, this is really close to real gluten pasta cavatelli, and not just like a chickpea kind of substitute panisse sort of thing that tasted like chickpeas. So that's kind of where my judging palate was as I was trying all of these. So back to our tomatoes. And we can still pepper in dough questions if you got them. Keep bringing them. So we have our tomatoes here. What we're going to do is what the French call a technique called concasse. Concasse roughly translate to mean to grind or to crush. So there's a few different ways to do this, all starting the same. We have to remove the peel from these tomatoes. My favorite way to do that is just to get all of your tomatoes. I pluck off that little stem piece that usually comes on there. And then coming on the bottom side, usually because it's the flattest and the most open, I'm going to come in here, grab a small knife. For me, that's a little bird's beak paring knife, but you can use any sort of knife that you have. You're going to come on this little bottom bit here, and you're going to give yourself a small little X. Now, you're not cutting super deep into the tomato. You're just scoring the surface, giving yourself a little X. And what that little X is going to do is going to make peeling these tomatoes much more easy. Now, like I said, as you're doing this, try not to cut super deep down into the tomato. For our purposes today, because we're turning these into sauce, nothing bad's going to happen if you cut it all the way down. You give yourself a really deep, really strong cut in the tomato. That's going to be all right. But if you were in a restaurant kitchen and a chef asked you to concasse a tomato, you don't want to have any marks on the tomato, especially on the bottom side, after you're done scoring and peeling them. You want them to look like perfect tomatoes, just peeled. And if you slash really hard and deep with your knife, they're not going to look perfect, which is totally fine in our case here. So this is like a very approachable recipe in that sense. But just so you know, the proper way to concasse would to not do that. So we have all of our tomatoes peeled, or prepared to be peeled. Question?
Yes, we have a couple questions.
Oh yeah, let's get into it.
Elena says, is it okay to put the dough in the fridge for later?
Elena's asking if you can put the dough in the fridge for later. You can stick it in the fridge for later. I would pull it out, make sure it's room temperature before you use it. So depending on how far later you want to eat this, being like later tonight, a couple hours, if it's like 2 hours or so, I would leave it on the counter. I wouldn't put it in the fridge to pull it back out from the fridge. If it's going to be like 6 or 7 hours from now, you can put it in the fridge for a couple of hours and then pull it out 1 or 2 hours before you want to use it. But a room temperature dough is going to be easier to use than a cold dough. And I don't know, I haven't tried, holding this dough overnight. I would prefer you make it the day you're going to use it. It only needs to rest for 5-10 minutes at the minimum. And so don't try to like get days ahead on making the dough. Question?
Yes, Judith would like to know, can we use canned tomatoes?
So Judith, canned tomatoes, absolutely. You can use them. Yes, that's going to be okay. You'll get a slightly different flavor to your tomato sauce. It's not going to be that like bright, summery tomato, but it's going to be a very light tomato sauce, which is still absolutely delicious. No reason why you can't use the canned. I would drain those juices off of the canned tomatoes, save those on the side. Hopefully you have the whole tomatoes in your can. And then when we get over to the crushing portion, after these are peeled, we'll be at the exact same point where you could work in your drained canned tomatoes with our peeled fresh tomatoes. Question?
Yes, the right BS. I'm super appreciative of this class being gluten-free, and I'm wondering what made you interested in testing gluten-free recipes. I wish more people would.
Oh, really good question. Someone's asking about why I'm doing this gluten-free. I mean, honestly, for all of you out there, I had been not necessarily anti-gluten-free. I totally understand it. I know it's a thing. I know there are celiacs out there. There are people that can't eat gluten. There are food allergies. It's real. It's not just in people's heads. It's a thing. And so I totally understood it. It was something I dealt with and cooked for people. Being in fine dining, you accommodate every allergy no matter what. You find a way to make food that is just as good, if not better, than the original version. And so thinking back to that, and Bella having a lot of allergies at some time for herself, wanting to accommodate those people. And so people were out there asking me, do I have a recipe? I didn't. And then finally I figured, well, why don't I? I have recipes for everything else. Why don't I work on this, make people happy, and kind of give them maybe what they're missing in the world of pasta. I mean, my life revolves around pasta. So I don't want people to miss out on that. I want it to be available to everyone. And then I thought too, this sauce, this tomato spaghetto, is great for even my gluten lovers and gluten eaters out there, because it's a sauce I haven't taught before. It utilizes something in season, and it's kind of a different technique handling fresh tomatoes versus canned tomatoes and pulling out different flavor profiles that you find in the tomato. So kind of really, it was for you. It was for all of you. And I really enjoyed doing it through the whole process. And now I actually have a gluten-free dough recipe, which is pretty awesome. Question.
Elena says, it's almost midnight here. I'm not sure if I could stay awake for the whole live. I would use the dough in the morning while watching the recording. So
I would say, Elena, give it a whirl. Stick it in the fridge. Pull it out tomorrow morning while you're making your coffee or whatever it is that you're doing. Let it temper, come to room temperature. Worst thing that's going to happen, it doesn't work. It's too sticky, and you end up having to remake the dough. Best case scenario, it works. There's no problems. And then you know in the back of your mind, more than me. Maybe you can message me and say, hey, it does work if you keep the dough overnight. So I would say go for it. Don't worry about it. Don't force yourself to stay up. You're good to go. Try it out. See what happens. Cool?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Just enough time for our water to be boiling. Love it. So we have our boiling water over here on the side. I'm going to grab some salt. We're going to lightly season our water. It doesn't need to be crazy salty. I just like a nice big pinch of salt in there. Probably about 1 tablespoon for each 2 quarts of salt that you have. About half as much as what you would use for pasta water. And then we're going to plunge all of our tomatoes into the boiling water. And this is going to happen fast. They don't sit in the water for long. We're talking 30 to 60 seconds. So I already have my ice bath set up. This is a bowl with water and ice making a bath. If you don't have an ice bath set up, I would get that first or be ready to grab that as soon as your tomatoes hit the water, because you want to be able to pull them out and stop the cooking right after about 60 seconds. So we have our tomatoes here. They're going into the water. And we're just going to let them chill. They're hanging out. What they're doing is that skin is separating, and because we gave that little score at the bottom, it's giving the skin a chance to peel back and away from. We're not looking to cook the tomatoes here. So there's no cooking. We're not trying to impart heat necessarily. We're using the heat to pull the skin away from the exterior of the tomato. And so ideally we want to keep the tomato fresh, vibrant, and raw in that same sense. So that's why we want to have the ice bath on standby. We're going to pull them out right away. We're going to add them into the ice bath to stop the cooking. That cold water, again, is going to help the skin shrink and pull away from the rest of the tomato. Because we made that little X cross hash there, that's the skin is going to come back even easier through that whole process. Now what I did mention, I'm using early girl tomatoes here. Now maybe you've heard that word before, maybe you haven't. Early girl tomatoes are simply a variety of tomato. It's a seed, it's a strain, just like San Marzano, Roma, beefsteak, green zebra, Cherokee. So many different varieties of tomatoes exist out there. Early girls in particular, very wildly popular nowadays, type of vine ripened tomato. The reason being is that they can be planted early in the year. They only take about 50 days to fully ripen, versus some other tomatoes could take like 70 to 90 days to fully ripen. Early girls will continue to produce fruit until the frost hits, where some other tomatoes will stop much sooner as soon as it starts to get chilly without any frost and they need heat. So it's just a much more robust strain of tomato. It's very table friendly. It's great for slicing, a good balance of sweetness and acidity. Here in San Francisco, there's a farm from down in Santa Cruz, a little bit south of here, called Dirty Girl Produce. And they made this early girl strain wildly popular and successful and well known up around this area. Funny enough, the way names work, so there's Dirty Girl Produce that grows the early girl tomato. An older strain seed of the early girl tomato is actually the Better Boy tomato. They use the Better Boy tomato, crossbred it with a different tomato to get the early girl, and right next to Dirty Girl Produce is Happy Boy Farm. So funny how they decide to name everything. Our tomatoes here are done. We're going to grab them from the water, go right into our ice bath. That was only about 60 seconds in the hot water. You can see the skin start to peel back from our tomatoes. That's all a really good sign. that we're at a good point to pull our tomatoes. So you can see the skin kind of retracting from the heat. We're going to drop those into our ice bath. We're going to lower our water temperature so it doesn't totally evaporate and disappear. And I'm going to use this same pot over here to cook my pasta later. So I'm just going to throw a lid back on this. We'll use that same water. It's already seasoned a little bit with the flavor of tomato, so might as well kind of keep that going. No sense in throwing that out and getting new water on the stove. Now our tomatoes here in our ice bath, they only need to sit in the ice bath for about a minute, but kind of that same thing. Whenever you're doing any vegetable, whether you're blanching broccoli or peas or tomatoes, and you put them into an ice bath, you don't want to just leave them in the ice bath forever. What ends up happening is then the flavor is going to get pulled out into the ice water. And so I've seen young cooks in the restaurant make this mistake. They're blanching a bunch of vegetables. They just keep everything in the ice water until they have time to get to it. Not what you want to do. As soon as everything's cold, cool, and the cooking process has come to a complete halt, you want to pull them out from the ice water, and then they can sit on the side until you're ready to use that. Same thing applies here to the tomatoes, or whether you're blanching any sort of other vegetable, whether it be green or not, cauliflower or broccoli. So we got a nice cool tomato. No more heat coming off of these. I'm going to go ahead and pull them out from the ice water. Got them over here on the side. And then we can get to the peeling process. Now there's no real trick to peeling a tomato. But what's nice is we already made that score down at the bottom, and the skin should peel away rather easily. Now tomato skin, you can save it, you can dehydrate it. It makes a really nice powder for whether you're topping croutons or pasta dough or sprinkling it on top of fish or something like that. Totally an option. In this case, I don't have a lot of skin left over. You need a substantial amount of skin for it to dehydrate and turn into a powder. So I'm just going to discard that little bit of skin that I have and use my ice water to help kind of rinse the tomato off and pull away any of that extra skin that's not wanting to come off. And so like I said, this whole process that we're doing is called concasse. Starting by peeling the exterior of the tomato, then we're going to remove the seeds. Now that removing the seed step, a little optional. Why is it optional, you may ask? Well, depending on if you have a food mill or not. So I have a food mill. I don't have to worry about pulling out the seeds of all of my tomatoes for the next step of the process. Now if you don't have a food mill, that's okay. You're just going to have to come in here with a knife in order to remove all of the seeds. And I'll show you how to do that in a few of these. And then the rest I'm just going to throw into my food mill, and we'll be able to process right through them and not have to worry about any of those seeds. Because a fresh tomato sauce is not going to have any of those seeds in there. You don't want the texture, you don't want the color. You want to keep it really fresh and light and vibrant. And same thing like with the skins, like there's no rule that says you have to remove all of these skins from the tomato, but the skins have a bunch of texture, and that could be a little off-putting for like a fresh and smooth and creamy tomato sauce. And so it's nice to kind of take this extra step to go through and peel all these tomato skins. Just like if you're canning tomatoes or you're buying jarred tomatoes, anything like that, they're always going to be peeled. And so whether you're going to do this for yourself or you're buying the jarred stuff, you'll never really find tomatoes with the skin still on them, just because that's not how they're preserved. That's not how we do them, because that skin's going to act as like a barrier to stop the preserving process. Fun fact is that actually every canned tomatoes, I don't know if you've realized this, you look at the can, they all have calcium chloride in there. It sounds like a weird ingredient, but calcium chloride is just kind of like another food additive to help things hold their shape. And so since canned food, especially canned tomatoes, goes through a pasteurization process and they're cooked in the can to pasteurize, they would normally disintegrate. They won't stay whole. But the calcium chloride that's in the can, believe me, go pick up any can of tomatoes from your cabinet. There's calcium chloride in there. The calcium chloride helps the tomatoes stay whole. In this case, if you're doing your own fresh canning, you wouldn't use calcium chloride. Your tomatoes might get a little softer and soggier, but that's kind of the secret. to how canned tomatoes always stay whole, no matter how old they are or how pasteurized they become. Fun facts. Question? No? Okay, I thought I saw a hand go up. All right, so we're coming in over here. Let me show you real quick how you would remove the seeds from the tomatoes if you wanted to go this route. So I like to just come in from the bottom, split open the tomato, and cut it into quarters. So now you have these quarters, and you can kind of see exactly where the seeds are in each of these quarters. I come down, and you're almost going to fillet it, much like if you're filleting a fish or anything else. You're going to pull out that little seed pocket, and you're going to be left with the flesh of the tomato. No seeds, no juice. And this is a great technique if you're ever making like pico de gallo or like a tomato salsa or something like that. And you always wonder like, oh, why is it so juicy, so watery, so wet? You'd always take this extra step, remove those seeds, even if you're going to leave the skin on, totally fine. And then you can come through here and dice this up into small little pieces. And this small little dice of peeled, seeded tomatoes is what in the restaurant or the French would call tomato concassé. So if you ever are staging in a restaurant or find yourself in a restaurant, or maybe you're on Master Kitchen and Gordon Ramsay asked you to make tomato concassé, now you know how to do it. Here it is. You just did it. So many uses for this. A great condiment and base for any sort of sauce or dressing or something like that. Now, if you have a food mill, you don't have to go through this extra step of pulling out the seeds and dicing the tomato. If you don't have a food mill, you're going to want to do that. You could throw it in the blender. Again, you'll still end up with the seeds. But what you're going to want to do is break that down as finely as possible. All of these tomato seeds and juice, all of these bits are really great. Like you can use them for salsa. You can blend them up, make tomato water. You can do a whole variety of things with them. Don't just throw them away. They make a really nice sauce. But for our case, we're not using them today for our sauce. So I just like to show how to do things. You don't necessarily have to do it the way that I'm showing you. I have a food mill here. This is the little medium sized base at the bottom. It sits nicely on top of the bowl. If you're interested in a food mill, I put a link down to one in the description of this video, or I put a link to this one down in the description of the video. And just one thing I found is if you are using a food mill, I like to give it a little bit of a head start and just quarter my tomatoes so that they can go right in. And I've heard, I haven't tried it just because it seems like, I don't know, I don't trust the food mill, I guess, is that you don't even have to peel tomatoes. You could throw them in and the food mill is going to hold the peel back. Now, I don't know, I guess maybe it's my restaurant background or just the way I've always done things. I feel like some of that peel is going to end up in here if you don't take it away. So that's why I like to make sure I peel everything before I start milling it. And I think it just helps the mill through the whole process, breaking everything down. And then coming out of the bottom, we have this, what the Italians would call tomato passato, or passed tomatoes, because they've been passed through the food mill. And so with these whole tomatoes, they have a tendency to kind of like jump around in the mill. Sometimes you have to give them a little hand to make sure they get caught under the blade, and the blade can do its job, and the tomatoes all get broken down. And this is only going to take a minute, but a minute I think is totally worth it to be able to have a fresh tomato passato like this. So I've done this with other tomatoes. A fun one to do this with is like if you ever see green zebra tomatoes at the market, they're a green tomato that's not the green tomato that you're used to seeing. Where most green tomatoes you see are like an unripened tomato you use for like fried tomatoes or fried green tomatoes or pickled green tomatoes. That's an unripe tomato. Where a green zebra tomato is actually ripened and it turns green and stays green. It's like a bright, beautiful green color. And so this is a great method to make a green tomato sauce, which is actually really cool because a lot of people have seen that. So last bit of tomatoes coming through.
Trout DJ says, never seen that. Once you're done milling, can you see the inside of the mill?
Yes, of course. So I got a couple more pieces of tomato to get in here. And same thing, breaking this up into small pieces before they go into the mill will definitely help the mill through the process. And all of this juice that's on your cutting board, you want to get all of this into the mill. That's all going to be tomato goodness and tomato flavor. Don't leave any of these juices and goodiness behind. And then I'm getting very close to the end. In the mill right now is just some tomato pulp and the seeds. So because I didn't take the time to seed all of these, all the seeds are getting stuck in the mill. A few seeds are going through, which isn't the end of the world. It's just because I didn't use the finest grate that I had for my mill. And you can kind of see, I'll give you a little sneak preview of what the inside looks like. That's all the tomato pulp in there and the seeds. And sometimes you just kind of got to get it with your hand, depending on the food mill that you have. And if you have a really squishy vegetable, sometimes it has a hard time grabbing it. But whenever you're using the food mill, you usually go about like 5 turns in the main direction. And then you go 1 turn in the opposite direction. And that helps clear the blade. So that way it can continue to process and work the rest of the mix that you have. So last bit of tomato just went through. Beautiful. Excellent. And so down at the bottom, all we have left there, wait, like the light right, you can see just some skin that didn't come off the tomato, all of those seeds and bits down at the bottom. I always like to remind people not to forget to scrape the last little bit of pulp off the bottom of their food mill. And then what we're left with is this beautiful bowl of fresh tomato juice. Tomato passata, passed tomatoes. I'm just going to wipe off my cutting board and my knife before I set this out of the way. And we can move right along to the next part of the recipe. Make sure you get any of these tomato bits that maybe jumped out of the bowl. Everything gets a nice wipe down. So, knives are done. Ice bath and bowls are finished. Excellent. We're left with our tomato here. And now we have some decisions to make. We have our fresh tomato going on here. I'm going to use this right away. So I like to get this, what I like to think of as like marinating. So we have these like fresh tomatoes. And if you ever like make yourself a tomato salad, maybe you're familiar with the idea of like slicing up all of the tomatoes, drizzling on a little bit of olive oil, salt, and pepper, allowing like the flavors to kind of come out of the tomato, to marinate the tomatoes, to make them juicier and better and more flavorful. So what we have here is still raw tomato that I like to marinate. So based on the amount of tomatoes I have here, I'm using 2 cloves of garlic. I'm going to take one of the cloves and just grate it raw into my tomatoes. So what this is going to do is going to allow the acid from the garlic and all those pungent flavors to kind of, 1, mellow out, so it's not like having a whole bunch of raw garlic in our sauce, and 2, it's going to allow our tomatoes to start to marinate. I'm also to this, same thing, there's no marinating without salt, so we're going to add a little pinch of salt to our fresh tomato passata, and we're going to stir that in. And if you've ever wondered what fresh tomatoes from the farmer's market and all of their essence taste like, this is a great opportunity. So sweet. It's almost like unbelievably sweet. When you have really good tomatoes, especially like at the peak end of summer, when they're as ripe as they can be, there's just so much sugar and sweetness in there. Almost like you've never tasted. And this is like pure tomato essence distilled down into a bowl. So we have that garlic, a little bit of salt in there, just so everything can start to marinate. We're going to set this aside. No need for this right now. And we're going to jump back to our pasta dough. So our dough's been resting. It's been probably about 15-20 minutes. Nice amount of time for our dough. And we can come right back to it. So we have our dough rested. I like to have some of my standby gluten-free flour mix to act as my bench flour. But just like when I'm making any sort of pasta, I don't like to just dust flour everywhere. Because one, then you get flour everywhere. And two, sometimes you don't need all of that extra flour. You only need to dust flour down if things are going to be sticky. So you don't really know until you start working. If you end up putting too much flour down, it could actually get in the way and make things harder. The dough will end up just sliding around the table, and then you're not actually getting any traction or tackiness in order to be able to move things around. So we're going to take our dough ball out. I'm going to use my bench scraper here to just cut off a small piece of dough. And you could be really precise and divide this up into 6, and then you have 6 snakes to work with. I'm just going to cut off a small piece on the side. Feeling this is about an ounce, about an ounce of dough, maybe an ounce and a half. I don't have a scale, so I can't tell you if I'm right, but pretty sure I'm right. So we have our dough. Now what we're going to do, we're going to come in here, and if you made any other sort of hands-made pasta class with me, you know exactly what's about to happen. What we're going to do is make what the Italians call serpentines, or snakes. So we're going to come in using the top part of our palms and the bottom part of our fingers. We're going to press down on the dough and start to roll it from the center out. Now the thing with gluten-free pasta, it is very delicate and it is very temperamental. The thing that normally allows dough to be stretched and to be elastic and to kind of give you that fluid stretchiness to move around is gluten. There is no gluten here. So essentially, any bakers out there that work with pie dough or makes tarts or know exactly what I'm talking about, pie dough and tart dough is the same thing. There's not a lot of gluten in pie dough and there's not a lot of gluten in tart dough. So working with this is very similar. It could crack easily and it's not going to be as forgiving, but we're going to end up with pasta and it's going to be gluten-free. So it's worth that little kind of give and take. There's a little bit of a drawback to you making gluten-free dough. It's not forgiving. Sometimes it cracks on you. It's kind of like working with a pie dough because it's very supple and soft and it can break apart very easily, but you'll end up with this snake here. So the width of my snake is about the width of my pinky. It's about 1 centimeter plus or so. You could go a little thicker if you'd like, but I find this width works very well. The length, not so important. Doesn't really matter. What I'm looking for is the thickness. One even equal thickness all the way across the entire dough. So now we're going to come in with our bench scraper, and you can use a knife for this if you don't have a bench scraper. I just really like using a bench scraper because it's dough, and bench scrapers are made for dough. We're going to come in and cut these into small little 2 centimeter chiclets.
Elena wants to know, is it okay to spray it with water if it gets dry?
Yes, Elena, good question. So if your dough is dry or you're working on a dry surface, using your spray bottle, misting just over the surface of the dough and allowing that water to gently fall down over the dough is going to be your go-to method here. But I really like this. It's not sticking to the table, it's not sticking to my hands, and it's not sliding around. I'm kind of right in that ideal range, and I use the exact amounts on the recipe down to the gram. So it worked out very well for me in this case. Now I have these little chiclets. Now you have a few different options on how you want to form these. You could form them by hand. There's no tools required necessarily. You don't need a knife, you don't need a bench scraper. And there's 2 different ways of doing it, depending on what you're comfortable with. You could use your finger and drag towards yourself, pressing your finger down in the middle, allowing the dough to curl up over your finger, creating a small indentation or cup, as the Italians would call this a cavatelli, or a small little hollow. Now taking that same piece of dough, using my thumb, instead of dragging towards myself, I'm going to use my thumb and push away from myself, allowing the dough to curl up over the back of my thumb, creating that cup indentation or hollow. Now I'll do that again on both, just in case you missed it. So with my finger, pressing and pulling towards myself, it curls up over my finger. It makes a small indentation or cup as a cavatelli. Same thing, coming in with my thumb, pressing away from myself, it curls up over the back of my thumb, and you end up with that small little cup or indentation, known as a cavatelli. So that's two different methods, no tools required. You could have a whole bunch of little dumplings, all gluten-free, very similar to the full-fledged gluten version cavatelli pasta. Now, I really enjoy them like this. There's not a whole lot of versatility when we're talking about gluten-free dough. They come out best like this, but you could do some other things with them. Starting with, say you have a gnocchi board or a cavatelli board. This is a wooden board with ridges. You can do that same motion, creating little ridges down on your pasta as these all start to roll down the cavatelli board. Now, something I always like to encourage people to do is to find tools around their house that can make those same indentations. That maybe they don't have a cavatelli board, but maybe they have a cheese grater of sorts. So you can still come on your cheese grater, roll off the edge, and you're able to get small little indentations on your pasta from a grater like this. I've seen people use forks and knives. I've seen people use avocados and oranges, all with that little kind of texture on the outside. Now, same thing if you do have a bench scraper. You could come in here and press and pull the pasta right over the end of the board, giving you all of these beautiful shapes. Now, what this is going to do is two things. You could cook the pasta in these large, unpressed nuggets here, but I don't like to do that because I find they don't cook as evenly. Where if you press this little cup into them, you're creating a waterway or a channel for the water to travel through. And then so the pasta cooks more evenly, things cook more quickly, and then you have a much better final texture in your dough than if you were to just cook it all as one little big piece. I'm going to cut another snake off here just so I could do one more round of these so I have enough to make a bowl of pasta. But we're going to continue the same process. We'll do it again. Are there any questions about this, about the dough?
Yes. The right BS, would we need to modify the recipe if we were to try and roll out sheets of dough?
So, good question. I have my dough sheeter out here. I'm going to sheet out the other half of this just to kind of show you. I tested it out. I didn't have to modify anything using the Caputo flour. I was not as successful rolling out sheets or noodles or filled pasta using the other flour. It was just a little less forgiving, and it didn't kind of let me do what I wanted it to do. Not saying you can't, it was just harder to work with. And so I found this, like I said, works the best. It has the best flavor. I think it has the best texture of all of the gluten-free mixes. And so now at this point, we're slowly building up all of our pastas here, rolling right down. And if you find that this is sticking or getting all over the place, don't be afraid to just dust it with a little bit of that gluten-free flour mix. But I'm in a really good spot with my hydration. Nothing is sticking, not even to each other, not to the tabletop. And so what we have here is, I would say, that's about a bowl of pasta for one, depending on, who you're cooking for. And we'll set that aside. We'll get to that when we cook. Now, like I said, I did want to show using the sheeter just in case someone wanted to go down that route and make things a little interesting. And so let's break it out. Let's do it. Let's see what happens. Just in case, right? We're all here. We might as well give it a try. So we have our sheeter. I'm going to open my sheeter up all of the way, allowing me to start nice and wide. I'm going to take out the last of my dough here. Give it a little bit of a flattening to kind of get it started before it goes into the machine. You can do this with a rolling pin if you'd like. I just don't think it's enough dough.
Angelique wants to know, how long would the dough keep for formed and unformed?
So I haven't tested how long this lasts. It's fresh pasta. So in theory, in my mind, it's fresh. I want to eat it fresh. If I wasn't making fresh pasta, I would buy dried pasta and I would eat it not fresh. That being said, I'm certain this will last till later tonight. If you're making it, it's the afternoon right now, you're not going to eat dinner till 8 or 9 o'clock tonight. You're not going to have any problem. Throw this on a plate in the fridge. The cold air, the fan, everything's going to keep it nice. It shouldn't stick together. You'll be good to go. Now, if you want to try to hold it longer than that, I'd maybe think about blanching it first, tossing it in a little bit of olive oil or nonstick spray, and then putting it out on like a sheet tray in the freezer or in the fridge or something like that. Just so that way it doesn't like start to get sticky or gummy sitting around in dough form. Now, I don't know if it will, but same thing kind of applies with like fresh pasta dough when I'm making fresh pasta, even if it's not gluten-free. I don't like to hold it around for long. It's fresh pasta. You just put all this love and work and energy into making something fresh. It's not going to get better the longer you let it sit around. It's only going to kind of get further away from where it once was. And so I don't like to like say, oh, it'll stick around for days, because it really won't. I don't want to like lie to anybody. But you can play around with it. Find what works best for you and what makes you happy. So before we go into our machine, I have this kind of flattened out so the machine doesn't need to do too much work. It's already about the thickness of my widest setting. So that way when it goes into the machine's just going to ever so gently and carefully stretch it out. I'm going to take a tiny bit of my flour mix and just kind of coat the outside of the dough and my hands and the table, just in case anything decides to start to stick. There's a little bit of flour there. Yes?
Natasha says, my dough is breaking. Is it because of this different gluten flour brand I used?
If your dough is breaking, it's possible. It's because of the different gluten flour brand you used. It could just be a little dry. Try spraying it with a little water as you're rolling it, and you might find that a little bit of extra water is all you need to kind of help hold it together, and it's just dry and crumbling because there's not enough water there. But like I said, this is the flour blend that I recommend for gluten-free because I find it is the easiest to work with. It holds together, it doesn't break apart, and it tastes the best.
Do you want to show a little wide angle so we can see the pasta going into the roller a little bit better?
Let's do this so you can see.
Sure.
Perfect. All right. So we're wide in the machine. We're going to go in, drop that down. It'll come right out the bottom. And now, as we put it into the machine, we just want to be ever so gentle and careful with it. So because there's no gluten, the thinner this gets, the weaker the structure's going to get. Like I said, think of it like pie dough. If you ever made pie dough, it feels very, very similar to that. And so we're just going to one number down every time it goes through the machine, making sure I don't need any extra flour. Using the back of my hands to pick up the dough and move them around. And if you notice it starts to crack around the edges, there's nothing you can really do about that. You can kind of try to press them together. But that's why you just want to work quickly. And again, it's gluten-free, but you're able to do a little bit of stuff with it here. So we're getting down, I'm to about number 5 right now on my machine, which is halfway. So what I did during my testing phases is I took this down a little too thin than when I was testing. And so it's almost counterintuitive at this point. Where, well, what I had always assumed, when you're working with gluten pasta dough or regular pasta dough, you usually want to roll it thinner than you think it needs to be. With the gluten-free, I found it's kind of the opposite for whatever reason. The dough doesn't souffle as much. There's not as much texture gained or kept when it cooks. It almost like it loses some texture. So I rolled this down too thin when I was making noodles and when I was making fill shapes. So I knew to myself, I took a mental note, I wrote it down. Hey, if I'm going to do this again, it needs to be rolled a little thicker, so that way I have that texture, kind of like these little guys here had really nice texture in them than here. So you're probably wondering what number am I actually using here on the machine. A note about pasta machines, if this is the first time you're here with me using one, congratulations, welcome, thank you. The sad news to that story is that every pasta machine is different. There's no universal set of numbers for making pasta when it comes to the roller. Simply because every machine, those numbers are just arbitrary. So for example, my machine here starts at number 10 and goes down to number 0. Now I know some series of the KitchenAid machines, depending on what year you bought it, will start at number 1 and go to number 8. Other versions of the KitchenAid will start at number 7 and go down to number 1. Other Atlas Mercados go from 1 to 10 being the thinnest. And so all of those numbers are totally arbitrary and specific to each individual machine. Now, all of that being said, what you can do is kind of go by reference points. So I know that I stopped 1 down from halfway. So 5 is halfway, I took this to 4. The last time I did it, I took it to 2 or 3, and both were still a little too thin for my noodles when I was cutting noodles. Now I would say maybe go 1 notch thinner if you want to do fill shapes. Now I tested this with filled shapes, and you would do exactly the same. You cut yourself out a little square, whether with your knife or your pasta roller. Give yourself a nice little square. You would mist it with a tiny bit of water just to help that stickiness. Put your filling there in the center. You'll fold it over itself and create your seal around the shape, so that way you have your filled pasta, but gluten-free. Now you can imagine there's filling in there if you wanted to go that route. Now, the beautiful part, because it's gluten-free dough, all these odds and ends and trim pieces can be worked back together and reused. You might have to get a little more water in there if they dried out, but because there's no gluten, nothing bad is happening. You're not overworking it, you're not underworking it. It's not really kind of getting to the point of being unusable. So if you find yourself with all these odds and ends, as long as they're not dry, you can reuse them, you can make more cavatelli, you can do whatever you want with them. Now for our noodles, if we wanted to go the noodle route, I don't recommend folding this up into that noodle form like I do when I'm making tagliatelle or tagliolini or any of those other shapes with an egg dough. Instead, you're going to have to come down using a knife or a roll cutter and cutting each strand individually, just because simply the dough doesn't have the strength to be folded and unfolded and picked up and manipulated. Again, there's no gluten, and gluten is the property of the dough that gives you that ability to manipulate it. So what else do I like to do to move this around, because I know it is very, very fragile and delicate, is I like using these wooden dowels. Now you can use a chopstick or a straw or something like that to be able to slide it here under the dough. And that way you could pick up all of your noodles. You could set them between like 2 bowls or 2 plates or 2 water bottles, 2 mugs. And that way you have your noodles. You'd slide them right down into the water when you're ready to use them. And you're able to move them around and carry them without them getting messed up in the kitchen. Question.
Can you show the ravioli process again, please?
Yes. So you have your flat piece of dough. I would cut it into squares, whatever size is totally up to you. You put your filling in the center of the piece of pasta. I like to mist it with a little bit of water just to create some tackiness. And then you would fold edge to edge to seal. And because I don't have filling in mine, I'm doing what's called a soppressini, or a little surprise, where it's like a tortellini but unfilled. And so that's kind of how we ended up with that. But if you did do, a filled piece of pasta, you can pretend, corner to corner, and then you kind of just seal down the edges, and now you have a triangle with your filling in the center. Or if you wanted, you press up and wrap it around and give yourself a little capelletti filled piece of pasta. But again, there's no filling in there. I didn't do filling today. Beautiful pasta, gluten-free. How we all feel about that? Questions?
Yay!
Yay! I feel like that deserves a celebration. Like if I had an applause button, I'd hit it and everybody would cheer and be like, "Yeah, we just made gluten-free pasta. So much fun." I feel really good about that. I don't know about you. It's an exciting thing. We're able to make the dough gluten-free. We're able to do the whole gluten-free process. And we have a variety of noodles that all kind of worked out in various ways. So now we're going to work on the sauce. We're going to bring this all together. Let's get our water real quick right back up to a boil. We can wipe down our flour surface. just to kind of get rid of any of these little flour bits that we have. And then we're good to go. Our water's coming up to a boil now. I'm going to grab a saucepan here. And we can start thinking about how this sauce is going to come together. Was that a question? No?
No, Kimberly says, I'm so excited right now. I'd totally be cheering if I could.
Yes, Kimberly, I'm with you on that one. I'm totally with you. So, in a separate saucepan here, I only have one burner. So we're going to have to do things in stages. But we're getting our pasta water coming up to a boil. In the saucepan here, we're going to get our sauce started. So you can call this a pomodoro de oro, which means a tomato gold or a golden tomato sauce. The gold coming from our butter and our olive oil. So I like adding the butter and the olive oil. If you're vegan, leave the butter out. It's still going to be delicious, not a problem. I just love butter and tomato. It's one of my two favorite combinations. And kind of unexpected too. You don't normally have butter with tomato. You're used to having olive oil with tomato. We all know what that tastes like. It's delicious. We love it. It's so good. But butter and tomato, something new, and it's quite delicious. So we're going to start off with a little bit of our olive oil and a little bit of our butter. The recipe calls for about 2 tablespoons. So we're going to use half of our butter, 1 tablespoon at the beginning, and we'll use the other half of our butter at the end, our 2nd tablespoon at the end. So now you have another decision here to make. How much do you like garlic? Maybe you've heard this before because you're an experienced cook and you know all about garlic and cooking, or maybe this is going to be news to you. But the way garlic works, there's a couple different ways to extract flavor from cloves of garlic depending on how you cut it. This applies to most vegetables. So the more you break something down, the more that flavor is going to permeate into the entire dish. Case in point, microplaning this garlic into our base here is going to give me the most garlicky flavor. Now maybe I didn't want a very strong or powerful garlic flavor. For whatever reason, I didn't like it, or I wanted it to be more about tomatoes. You could crush the garlic clove, putting it in. That will just infuse a little bit of flavor. Maybe you wanted something in the middle. You can thinly slice the garlic clove, which is going to give you more flavor than crushing, but less flavor than microplaning. Or you could just throw the garlic clove in whole, which will give you the least amount of flavor, but still that essence of garlic. Now that same thing applies to just about every other vegetable, whether it be carrots in a stock or onions in a soup. When you're making vegetable stock, whether you slice, quarter, leave whole, or puree your vegetables before they go into the stock is going to determine on how vegetal and how much color imparts into that stock from the veggies. Pretty universal, but one of those kind of techniques and theories and ideas that can easily or often get overlooked. So something just to think about, right? Our water is just about boiling, but I'm just going to kind of do a little quick swap here on the side and let's move my basil plant. Get my olive oil and my butter and my garlic aromatic and melted. If I had 2 burners, obviously, yes, it'd be ideal to be doing these 2 things at the same time. But you know what? We have the one. So we're going to make it happen. If you have that 2nd burner on your stove, great. We have the garlic here on the side. We have our tomatoes. We have our water. All of our components are here. It's ready. It's coming together. We're just going to melt this all down. And now same thing, we have another couple of options at this point once this kind of gets all melty and warm and delicious. You could add some other seasonings or flavorings. You get in there with a little bit of chili flake. You can melt a fillet of anchovy. You could add a pinch of oregano. You could really kind of use this as a base for a variety of endless possibilities. Now when it comes down to a sauce like this, but like most Italian recipes, less is more. So if you're not into anchovies or you don't want that salinity or saltiness or fishiness, you could just go with the garlic. On that same token, you don't even need to get this garlic in here if you don't want. If you just want that little bit of garlic that we've already added to our tomatoes, that's totally an option as well. But we just want to get that bloomed. I'm in the mood for something a little spicy, so I'm going to go a small little pinch of chili flake here, just to kind of carry through. It smells floral, fragrant, garlicky, buttery, aromatic. Butter and garlic, one of my favorite smells. And so you can see here in our pan, we got our melted butter, our chilies, our garlic, our oil. Now we can come back on the stove, finish bringing our pot to a boil, doing a little bit of a swap game here. And then we're gonna grab our tomato sauce and we're gonna add it to our oil and our butter. Now I have probably twice as much tomato sauce as I do pasta, so I'm not going to add all of this. If you did make all of the dough, turn it all into cavatelli, you can add all of the sauce at once and make this in one big batch. But because I'm doing a single serving, I'm going to use probably about half this amount of sauce, just for demonstration purposes. Don't forget to stir this up so that you get any of that pulp or anything all mixed together. I'm going to say that's probably about a cup, maybe a cup and a half. It's about a cup of our tomato mix. It's about half of it. The other half I'm going to save. That's going to help stop the cooking so the garlic doesn't continue to cook. Our water is boiling. We can come in with the rest of our salt and season this up like it would be pasta water. Because remember, we only did a light amount of salt the first time around with our tomatoes. Now we can go a little heavier with the rest of the salt. Seasoned pasta water. Pasta water should taste like a well-seasoned soup. It should taste like water soup or water stock. It shouldn't taste as salty as the sea. That's just way too salty. Now we're going to come in with our noodles. I'm going to cook all of my cavatelli. We'll go down into the water. And now fresh pasta like this cooks very fast. Gluten-free pasta I found cooks even faster. And because we're employing this very saucy technique, we're not going to cook it in the water here very long at all. We're going for about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes in our water just to kind of set the noodles, set the starches, cook the egg through so things don't get mushy. But as soon as you see that the things start to float, I'm going to give it about another 30-45 seconds, and we're going to lift them up out of the water. We're going to add them to our tomato and then bring our tomato mixture back to a boil. And what we're going to do here is cook these very similar to a way that they do cook dried pasta in Sardinia, down in the south of Italy, is where they'll start with a big pot of our tomato passata or tomato water, all that liquid that comes out of tomato. They'll add their dry spaghetti or dry pasta straight to all of that, bring it to a boil and reduce and cook it down. So the entire time the pasta is soaking up the tomato and it's reducing and concentrating flavor rather than the pasta sucking up pasta water. That just tastes like water and salt. So our noodles are floating. They come to the top. I'm going to grab them right out of the water. They've only been there about 1.5 minutes or so. We can take now our noodle pot off the heat, and we'll bring this pot right back on. We're going to bring this back up to our simmer now, and we're going to continue to cook this down. It'll thicken. The pasta will finish cooking. At this point, it's still very al dente, probably on the side of like it's raw in the center and just cooked on the outside, which is okay. And it's going to come together. So now at this point, again, we have another choice to make. How tomatoey do we want our sauce to be? Do we want to really highlight that fresh tomato flavor? Or do we want to kind of like elevate it a bit? I'm going to choose to elevate mine a little bit with my basil. Now my basil, I have still the root ends on there. That's why I keep it in the water. So what I'm going to do is just pick off some of these stems. I'm probably going to use maybe 2 little stems, like so. I'm going to save all of my leaves that I have here for garnish. And I'm going to just toss my stems into the tomato water that's going to cook down. It's going to infuse ever so gently with that tomato flavor without it being like too basil-y. And now if you've hung out with me before, if you've cooked with me before, you know I normally talk about adding basil at the end of the dish because basil is a softer.
Sorry.
Hold that thought. There's a question.
Yes, one question. The right BS, do we want to reserve any of the pasta water for the sauce?
So I'm not saving any of the pasta water. I took a little bit, maybe an ounce or two of the pasta water with me into this pot as it was coming out. If you're making the cashewy pepe sauce, this starchy water works very well for blending your cashews, for helping thicken your sauce and making it nice and creamy and cheese-like. But otherwise, you don't really need that pasta water anymore. There's enough starch from the noodles cooking in the tomato, where normally most of the starch is in the water. But because the longer part of the cook is going to be in the tomato, a lot of our starch is going to end up in here, and things are going to thicken up and get nice and creamy and beautiful on its own. Very good question, though. Was there another one, or that was it?
Yes, Kimberly said your basil plant looks so good. How do you not kill it? All of mine died.
So I can't take credit in the fact that I grew this basil plant. I got it at the farmer's market. The basil I get at the farmer's market comes with all of the roots still on it. So when I get home, I put it in a pot of a mason jar of water. I change the water every day. I just keep it somewhere like room temperature on the counter. And it lasts like 2 weeks or so. It's just like, I don't think it grows new basil, but it keeps my basil fresh long enough to be able to use it. Where in the fridge, basil often wilts very easily and will die and get brown quickly. Where this kind of like just gets a longer life out of it. Maybe not necessarily like more basil, but longer life of basil. Questions?
No.
What was I talking about where I was holding that train of thought?
Basil?
Was I talking about basil?
Pasta.
Gosh. Does anyone remember? I totally lost my train of thought when that question happened.
That's okay.
Remind me if you all remember, because I forgot. I'm splattering a little bit, so I just clean up as you go. Don't splatter. And what I'm doing is I'm just swirling, moving this around as it's reducing and coming down and cooking. The reason being is because I don't want anything to burn or stick to the bottom. If you don't move pots or pans as things are cooking, there's a chance that things are going to stick if they stay in one spot the whole time. And so being able to rotate, to move, to bring this all together is really going to help kind of bring this down. And make sure nobody's sticking or scorching at the bottom of the pan.
Adding basil, starchy
Oh,
water
fresh.
in the beginning,
Fresh
adding
basil. Fresh basil.
yes.
Fresh
Yes.
basil. Yes, thank you, whoever said that. Is this too loud, I just realized? Maybe? I don't know. Everybody probably has their volume adjusted at this point anyway. So I'm going to keep half an eye on this. Basil. If you've hung out with me before, you know I talk about basil being a fresh herb. I always like to add fresh herbs at the end of the cooking. What I mean by that is like basil, parsley, mint, soft herbs. You add them right at the end so that you preserve their freshness, their beauty, their delicateness of the herb, and you kind of get that bright, nice sweetness. If you've ever made the Sasto family gravy with me, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We don't put the basil in at this point because what would end up happening is the basil gets cooked down, it gets mushy, it really just kind of gets muddled and lost. Now, the reason why I already added my basil stems and I'm not adding any basil leaves is because I actually want that basil flavor to get cooked down and pulled into the tomato. I want this dish to really be about those early girl fresh tomatoes. Ideally, everyone's getting their tomatoes at the farmer's market or from somewhere reputable where you know it's like a tomato from somewhere nearby that was actually picked ripe and not put into a room with a bunch of ethanol and turned red. Ideally. And so we want to celebrate that beautiful freshness of the tomato and not necessarily that beautiful freshness of the basil. The basil's kind of singing harmony here to the melody of our tomato. And so I want that tomato to really be the star. I don't want it to be overpowered by the basil by adding the basil at the end and really that being that bright note. The tomato is going to be the bright note all the way through the whole dish. So now you can see here, we are getting thick, we are getting creamy. This is reduced down. We're not all the way there yet, but we are definitely getting there. I sometimes like to give it a little tasty taste just to check how we're doing. Oh yeah. That's delicious. That's so sweet. That is wild that there's no sugar in there. What I do need is a little bit of salt. Just a touch, a little scant. Bottom of the salt container. A little bit of salt there just to kind of help balance everything out. And now this is a dish I'm not going to add grated parm to the top of. I don't think it needs the parm. Again, not every pasta dish needs parm. Doesn't need grated cheese on top. if you're into that, if you love it, if you can't live without it, go for it. I'm not going to hold it against you, but just try it with with the little pieces of basil on top, with just the pasta and the tomato. Sometimes less is more, especially when it comes to Italian food, and you don't always need that sharp, salty, umami-rich, nutty cheese grated all over your pasta. Sometimes you just don't always need it. And this is a great example of that, where it's really about the sauce, it's about the noodles, it's about everything kind of singing off each other where you don't need that garnish. Now that being said, this does work very nicely to have a nice spoonful of ricotta cheese. You kind of get that creamy richness that almost like acts as like a palate cleanser that cuts through all of that umami and acid and sugar and sweet and burst of flavor that comes from the tomatoes. And so if you do want to do that nice dollop of ricotta on there, I approve and I recommend it. But again, maybe not totally necessary. It is all about this tomato spaghetto. Question.
Kimberly wants to know, since it is gluten-free, how is it staying firm and not getting mushy as you cook it longer and longer in the sauce?
So, good questions. I'm going to turn this down to low because we're right at the end. Things are getting nice and thick. We're nice and creamy. And I'm going to answer that question, and then we're going to finish our sauce. You said, why? How is it not falling apart? A couple of reasons. We're using a gluten-free flour blend. All of those flours and blend are formulated to come together and hold and stay together. The egg in there acts as a binder that holds everything together. Third, we didn't cook the pasta all the way in the water. It only cooked for about a minute in the water to help set it. Then we finished cooking it the last 3 to 4 minutes here in the tomato. So think of the tomato just as more boiling water. All we did was cook the pasta, the amount it should be cooked. But instead of cooking it in water, we cooked it in tomato. And because it was fresh tomato water, all of that concentrated, we removed all of that excess water, leaving us with just tomato, all of this yummy goodness. And then so now we have this ultimate creamy, rich, and there's still starches in here. Like, it's not starch free, it's gluten free. So there's still rice starch, there's potato starch, there's vegetable fibers, all from the pasta. So you're still able to get that really thick, really creamy, really rich, lacquered coating that you would normally get on pasta that comes from the starches of wheat. In this case, we're using the starches of rice and the starches of potato and the starches of other things. Now I'm going to come in here. Last thing, that other tablespoon of butter. Now again, totally optional, but butter and tomato, again, one of my favorite combinations. And I'm just going to melt that last bit of butter in here. If you're vegan, don't worry about it. You don't need this little last step, but I'm doing it. Swirl that in until it's melted. I'm going to remove my 2 little basil pieces now.
And then how long would the leftover ricotta keep its shape for?
The leftover ricotta keep its shape. Say that again.
The leftover whipped ricotta keep its shape for?
Oh, I would say, whipped ricotta, normally I don't hold it for more than like a day. You could it'll hold for tomorrow. But it's aerated. So the longer you keep it around, it's like whipped cream. Whipped cream doesn't stay forever. Air eventually disappears. It'll deflate. Kind of that same thing with ricotta. Ricotta cheese on its own doesn't have a long shelf life once you open it out of the container. Think of it the same way. As long as that ricotta is going to last, whether it be 3 days, is usually what I go with on there. But let's go ahead and plate this up. I realize my ricotta is in the fridge in the other room. Oh no. I should grab it though, because it needs it. It's going to be delicious. Here, let's get a little zoom in action. We're going to bring the plate right up here. Oh my God, look at this. Like, creamy, rich, a good sign that your sauce has become one with the pasta is you can drag your spoon through the pan and the sauce doesn't just pool right back into it. That way you know that your noodles are going to hold the sauce, that the sauce isn't just going to pool at the bottom of your bowl, and everything has become friends. There's that happy marriage of everything together as one. I'm going to be back in 2 seconds. Everybody is plating their food. Real quick, I'm going to grab my whipped ricotta.
Everyone's plating. Yes, it looks so good.
Oh, and it smells so good too.
Mm-hmm.
That's how close I am to the fridge. Look, I'm already back. All right, so now we'll come in, clean spoon. Nice dollop of whipped ricotta here in the middle. The nice thing about whipped ricotta is it kind of like holds its shape nicely. So you can do a nice dollop. You can use the back of the spoon to create a little moat down in the center. And then you can come in with basil oil, fennel oil, hyssop oil would be really nice. But that way you kind of get that beautiful essence of basil without having to add all of the fresh leaves into the tomato stew. And then again, just a couple of leaves. A little bit goes a long way because you want this to be about look at that beautiful plate. Oh my God. I'm so excited to take a bite of this.
Me too.
Look at that. Our gluten-free pasta. Do you think you'd ever hear me say, I'm so excited to take a bite of gluten-free pasta? And yet, here we are. Here I am. Today, we're all evolving. We're always getting better. We're all becoming better versions of ourselves. And I think this gluten-free is a prime example of that. Let's give it a little taste test. Quality control. Oh my God. I'm telling you, I've had worse gluten regular pasta than this. It has that texture, it has that bite, it has that little bit of bounce. And that's why I like the cavatelli. That tomato spaghetto, forget about it. Tomato in a way you've probably never had before. Just so memorable. It's like celebrating summer, celebrating the tomato, bright, acidic, sweet, just like every essence of tomato all in one. You get that creamy bit of ricotta in there. Kind of like helps clear the palate, cut through everything. And then just enough basil to kind of remind you that tomato and basil are best friends, but they don't always need to be together. You could have tomato without the basil, and it's still going to be delicious.
Yay!
My God.
All
So
right.
good. Everyone give yourself a round of applause.
Good job, everybody.
Well done, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Drop any questions down into the chat as we wrap this all up. One last note I always like to share with everyone who sticks around and takes these classes with me. Thank you for supporting me, for allowing me to do what I do and teach and share my love of cooking and love of food with all of you. Now, that being said, it's live. Maybe you're watching this as a recording, or maybe you have a question in the future and you want to reach out to me. Find me on Instagram, chef.joe.sasto. Shoot me a direct message, but include the taco emoji, the little taco, in the first line of the message. That way I can see it. I know it's our secret code that you've taken a class with me. And that way I can find your message, I can find you. It doesn't get lost in the mix. And I can take the time to respond to you and make sure you get a proper answer to whatever it is that you're asking. That's not all. Please, if you haven't already, down right here on the YouTube to screen, should be right down here, hit that subscribe button for me. It's like hitting follow on Instagram. I imagine you're already following me. Please just hit the subscribe button on YouTube. It does a lot for me. I would appreciate that favor. You're not going to get any notifications or anything crazy like that. It's just hitting subscribe. You can log into your Gmail and you can do it. Everyone has that. So that, again, I appreciate you. Coming up to the future, thinking about the future. You enjoyed today. I know this is probably not for everyone because a lot of you are gluten-free out there, but I'm throwing it out there anyway. A couple weeks from now, we're doing an agnolotti class. Not your classic filled meat roasted agnolotti. We're doing a saffron yogurt garlic chicken stuffed agnolotti. One of my favorite things, agnolotti. I can't get enough of that shape. Thinking even further to the future, maybe that one's not for you. We're doing a pumpkin spiced ricotta gnocchi class. Again, that would be a good one for gluten-free people to sub out the regular flour for the gluten-free flour. That would work very, very well. Pumpkin spiced ricotta gnocchi. That one is not through Chef's Feed. That one's with one of our partners, Truffle Shuffle. They're doing ingredient kits that can get delivered to your door with everything you need right on your doorstep a couple days before the class. That you can find links for either on their Truffle Shuffle page or on my mailing list. Every time I send out an email, you can find it in there. I think that covers all of the housekeeping. Shout out to Bella, as always. Thank you for joining us and for helping. Couldn't do it without her. And I couldn't do it without all of you. Are there any other questions before we say our goodbyes?
No, just a suggestion. The Wrights BS. Thanks so much. Would love a gluten-free pizza class.
There is a gluten-free pizza class. It already exists. Send me a message on either Chef's Feed or Instagram, and I will send you the links. It's marketed as a calzone class, but I also included the gluten-free dough recipe in there as well and working with it. So another option.
And then Tamara says, did you put the basil stems in the tomato soup?
Basil stems went in here. I picked them out right before I plated. So they got cooked down the whole time. Pulled them out, and then just those little leaves and the basil oil on top.
All right.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Very,
Thank you.
very well done. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the weekend, enjoys the rest of the day.
Yes.
And whatever it is that you're doing, go out there, eat pasta, and make love. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great Sunday.